Does the word obedience make you cringe? Maybe your main association with it is from taking it out of wedding vows or from a strict parent. It definitely evokes control, right? In this video, I'm going to tell you how the word obedience came to be one of the touchstone values in my life, and offer you some ways you might consider it too. Hi everyone, I'm Sonja, and this is Wholiness Connection. During what I call my spiritual awakening back in 2009-2010, it was an ecstatic experience, but it was also an experience where I became even more grounded in my body and with others. I became more aware of the stirrings of the spirit, or of intuition, inside of me, both kind of on the inside and on the outside. I became more aware of those. And I had a sense of calling to follow this attunement. I remember a specific time when it felt like falling to my knees and almost becoming knighted. It was kind of the best metaphor I can think of for it. It felt like this sense of being knighted for the journey ahead, almost. And the word that came to my mind then was the word obedience. Though I didn't necessarily latch onto it completely then, I kind of felt like, oh, I don't quite know what to make of that word, but it definitely came to me. And not so long later, maybe it was around a year later, I actually learned the origins of the word from the spiritual teacher Cynthia Bourgeot, who talked about obedience and pointed out that the origin of the word is obbedire, which means essentially listening. And then as soon as I heard that explanation for the origin of the word, everything came together, the attunement, that sense of the calling, and why obedience had come to me. So obedience is now this touchstone value in my life. And what it means to me is a sense of deep listening and actually paying attention to what is stirring within us or outside of us. What are these sacred stirrings? So you don't necessarily have to use the word obedience. If it just doesn't strike you as still a good way of talking about it, you could simply call this deep listening. Next, I'd like to share with you a few ways, 3 ways that you could approach this idea of obedience as deep listening. So one interesting way to think about it is that this kind of deep listening, in a sense, makes one very present or mindful on a sort of daily or moment by moment basis. So it's a helpful value for being very present and aware and attuned in our lives. And one way to work with it, kind of like with some other mindfulness type practices you may have done. So one way to work with it is to sort of try to be as continuously aware, or in this case, listening deeply as possible and attuned, and to simply come back to it when we notice that we've gone away from it. Sometimes it can help to have a cue, like every time you go through a doorway, you maybe first do that very consciously where you check, and then sometimes then you start to associate it, so you might naturally come back to it every time you go through a doorway, or whatever type of way would work for you. Some people prefer not to think of it as continuous as that. Another good way to work with this kind of deep listening practice and attunement that I call obedience could be to have a check-in time. So maybe you set a timer for once an hour, and then at that point you would check in with whatever feels like it's stirring within you or outside of you that is calling to you. So then when the timer goes off, you would check in with yourself sort of inwardly and outwardly, and come back to that sense of attunement and deep listening. And I think that practice, even though it's once an hour, because you would be doing it so regularly, also starts to become something more continuous as you do it. A second way of approaching this concept of obedience as deep listening is by a practice of actually asking for an answer to something. So maybe there's something troubling you, or not. It could just be a general question that you have, and you could put a question out there, and whether you conceptualize that as prayer, whether you conceptualize it as trying to get the meaning from your own subconscious or intuition, the attunement would then help you to hear the answer, right? So it could potentially come to you in a flash of insight, but maybe it won't be right when you ask the question. Maybe it's sometime the next day and it just pops into your mind. Or maybe you hear something that someone else says and it feels like it's answering that question. That could be another example. Maybe it even comes to you in a dream. And so this leads into my third approach, which is to be very open to however the attunement stirs in you. So whether it's an answer to a question or whether it's just attunement in general. So it can be very helpful to be mindful not only of our inner insights, maybe even thinking of how our body is and exploring that a little more, but also be open to other ways in the outside world that we might get an answer or just some sort of intuitive insight. And so sometimes people call some of these kinds of things synchronicities. Like maybe you see words on a van going by. That's happened to me before, where it felt relevant and sort of like a little extra insight into something I was thinking of right then. So some people might call that a synchronicity kind of an experience. Sometimes those can involve multiple things happening that are the same, so it almost feels like something's trying to get your attention. But whether you call it synchronicity, whether you prefer to think of it as a reticular activating system in our brain being ready and attuned to, that's sort of our filtering system. So when we've asked a question or when we're attuned, we might notice things that are more relevant to us. Whether you think of it as that way, I tend to think of it as both, a little of both. Whichever way you think of it, it's very important to be open to all the different kinds of ways that our deep listening can occur and give us stirrings and insights. So this deep kind of listening or attunement that I call obedience is very much about being open to everything and not having expectations for that attunement. Whether or not obedience is a word that you'd like to reclaim, it's interesting, this idea of reclaiming words or concepts that maybe have struck us as not the right thing for us in the past. So I'd be curious if you put in the comments if you have any words that you've reclaimed or considered reclaiming that might have a deeper meaning for you, whether it's because you discovered the root meaning of the word is different than you thought, or it just happens to be a season of your life where it feels relevant to you. So go ahead and put in the comments, is there a word that you really don't want to reclaim? You can put that too. Or is there a word that you're considering reclaiming or that you have reclaimed? Hopefully this video is helpful to you. I would love it if you would like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next video.